Good morning and welcome to MCERA's Q&A on the future of NAPLAN. NAPLAN testing would normally begin this week, but its suspension provides an opportunity to discuss its underlying purposes, how our education system can best serve these goals, and also whether or not NAPLAN should continue in its present form. Each of our researchers will speak for a couple of minutes from their areas of expertise, and then we'll move to a panel discussion and take questions. You can ask your questions via chat or put your hand up to request to ask them via video or audio. While you're not speaking, we ask that you remain on mute. The session will be recorded and may be shared in our social media channels. If you'd like help getting in touch with any of the speakers afterwards, feel free to email us at media@mcera.org.au. I'll hand over now to the experts, starting with Professor Jim Tognolini of UNSW Sydney, an expert in education management who had a hand in NAPLAN's design. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm not an expert in educational management at all, I'm afraid. I'm a
measurement.
Measurement. I might like to be an expert in management. Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me onto this panel. When I was asked to speak on the panel, I was reflecting on NAPLAN and what I thought and where I think it should be. And I went back to an article that I wrote a little while ago now on following Sarah Mitchell's comment about when she said in June last year, 2019, that NAPLAN is flawed and it needs to be rethought from a clean slate. And I agreed totally with her, at least partly the first bit and totally the second bit. NAPLAN itself, I think, is actually a very good test. And all the metrics will tell you that. It's flawed in the sense that it's the way the results come out and the way they're misinterpreted and misused, which then detracts from the quality of the test, and that causes a lot of the problems we've got. So I think it is flawed because we haven't sold it well enough of what you can do with it, what you can't. Then I went to the next bit. If I was asked to say what should happen with NAPLAN and what we should do, and I looked at what all the speakers here have said, and I found myself agreeing with every one of them. And I thought, well, the real question, if you're going to start with a blank sheet, shouldn't be, I think this is the way to do it. The real question is, what do we want as the purpose of NAPLAN? We should have an open discussion. What do we want it for? Do we want it to be part of teaching and learning? And then let's state that's what we want. Do we want to be able to compare states? Can they be put together? They're things that we have to discuss. Once we get the purpose right, then we can design the test to give us a valid and reliable measure that is more useful than what it is at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. We'll go from Jim to Pasi Sahlberg, Professor Pasi Sahlberg of UNSW Sydney and the Gonsk Institute.
Thank you very much, Scott. First, I would like to state that all world-class education systems today have a national assessment policy that helps them to monitor and see how the system is performing. But if you look at what these national assessment programs do, they're very different from what we have here in Australia through NAPLAN, that is testing all the students in years 3, 5, 7, and 9 every year in 2 subjects, and then makes these data serve for a number of different purposes. And it has become more evident than ever before that it's not possible to use the same student assessment to inform teachers about students' learning needs or report to parents what their kids are actually learning in school, or show schools where they stand vis-a-vis the other schools in the systems, or inform policymakers how the system performs, or tell parents where the good schools are. And these are all the examples that that the NAPLAN is used, sometimes more and sometimes less here in Australia. I think that the purpose that a national standardized student assessment program or policy like NAPLAN should have is to focus on monitoring education systems performance against agreed purpose of education that Jim was talking about, particularly on the issues of quality of education outcomes and equity of the system, and also the students' well-being and attitudes towards learning. And these are the things that are increasingly now the focus of both international large-scale assessments like PISA and TIMSS, but also the national assessments. I think also that the more cost-effective and equally reliable alternative to the current NAPLAN that we have here is a scientifically determined sample-based assessment that also would remove the unintended harm on children and teachers often caused by the current model here. This would also lead to stronger role of teachers in student assessment and reporting to parents as well, and the community how their schools perform against their agreed goals and expectations. So in summary, all world-class education systems are modernizing their national student assessment policies as we speak, so that these policies, these assessments would capture a broader range of educational outcomes and these purposes, and also engage teachers more to judge what the students are learning. And with this, can I pass this over to my colleague, Dr. Lee in the UNSW? Jihyun, please.
Okay, thank you, Pasi. So this is my view. With much debate of what NAPLAN is for and what it's not for some reason, NAPLAN hasn't been used much to shape national policies. One possible reason is that a deep concern relating to NAPLAN has been about individuals, students, teachers, principals, and even parents. At most, the debate went to the school level concerns that school performance data being exposed to the public. However, the information from NAPLAN can be used to address equity issues in Australia because it reveals student achievement gaps by family socioeconomic background. Much of the space in the school profile page of my school website is allocated to show that each school has a different level of socioeconomic background. In the space on the website, the emphasis given to socioeconomic background suggests that NAPLAN performance is not entirely schools' responsibility. It is, in fact, the opposite. School performance largely depends on socioeconomic background of the families who send the children to their school. That is an important, substantial pre-existing condition of the school. Even with this recognition, there hasn't been that much at the policy level to reduce school performance gap. So my argument is that NAPLAN can be used even much more by the government to shape and recognize where national policies are needed, especially with respect to fixing some of the most critical pre-existing conditions of the schools that hinder student performance. I will pass this mic to Stephen Lewis from Deakin University.
All right, thank you very much, Jihyun. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I think we've heard a few speakers so far talk about the original purpose of NAPLAN and how well that NAPLAN purpose is aligning with how it's actually being used by policymakers, by school leaders, by teachers, by students. And I think in this moment of COVID-19 shutdown, it really does bear responsibility on us as educators and as people concerned with education to consider how well NAPLAN is fit for purpose from how it was originally designed to how it's being used, and identifying the critical gaps that are emerging between that original purpose and its implementation. As we've heard, like NAPLAN is very much initially designed to provide a system level taking the temperature, if you like, how well are individual states and different jurisdictions and different areas of the country performing in education. What it's not initially intended to provide, even though it's very much been taken up this way, is an individual holding to account of schools, of teachers and of students. And it's this discrepancy which I find quite damaging. It ends up basically creating a situation where NAPLAN doesn't just become a measure amongst a broad suite of measures that teachers and schools and policymakers might have access to, but it effectively becomes the only measure that really counts, because you're using it to assess how well students are doing, schools, teachers, systems, etc. So it's become like a one-stop shop for measuring student and school effectiveness and teacher effectiveness without it being designed to do so. And I think the major risk that comes from that, as well as providing a slightly misleading or misguided assessment, is that that one measure ends up displacing the opportunities and the capacities for teachers and school leaders to demonstrate and exercise their professional judgment and knowledge. Remember, these are teachers who spend all day, every day with their students. they know them best, and we need to trust those teachers to know them best and not rely on one, external measure that occurs once a year and as we've heard multiple times now, is not necessarily being used for the purposes which it was designed. But with that, I'll throw it back to Scott Arthurson of MCERA, and he'll conduct and help manage the Q&A. So thank you, Scott.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you everyone for those talks. Those were very enlightening. So we'll move over to questions and discussion now. So if anyone has any questions, either put your hand up in the participants section or just send it to us via chat. I guess there's a tension that emerges here between NAPLAN's use as a tool for shaping large-scale policy and its use as a metric of individual performance, which seems to be running through all of this. Can that tension be resolved? Could everyone, all the panelists, come back on video and bring your audio on? I guess I'd like to hand first back to Jihyun on that topic, just talking about this idea of using it for large-scale policy, but in light of what Stephen's saying, that it gets used all the time as sort of a metric of individual performance. I mean, can there be a way of resolving this tension in its use?
Yeah, I mean, as Stephen mentioned, that we know that the original purpose of NAPLAN was not supposed to compare schools and get the data from the individual and then so about teachers and so on. But now it is being used that way, and I mean, even with so much education, so to speak, done at the school level, schools still doing it. So we are at a point that maybe we'll just let the school use NAPLAN the way they use, but having more emphasis at the policy level now, which can be done actually by the government. So government is only interested in whether the student scores going up and down, but don't use much more than that. So if the government can have more creative ideas about how to use a NAPLAN data, not just for student score going up and down, but use more a variety of way of policy levels, maybe the debate can be shifted, and then maybe the school and teachers might have less emphasis on the individual scores.
Right. So Jim and Pasi, would you agree that NAPLAN shouldn't be used for that kind of measurement?
In terms of use for large scale and at the school level, is that what you're saying for that kind of measurement?
For individual measurement, for measuring individual performance.
The thing is that it wasn't designed for that. I mean, it wasn't designed to measure individual student performance and use in that way. And therefore, when you use something that's not designed for that, you haven't got any evidence it works. So there's a real issue about the validity, the usefulness of NAPLAN and how it's changed. So could it be used for both and could it be done for both? Yes, it can be. But you have to then say, if that's what we're going to do, how are we going to design it? What things are we going to put in place to make sure it can meet both criteria that you want to do? Yes, it can be done. But let's start off with that. Let's collect evidence that's working properly in that way, and then you can use it properly and with confidence. Otherwise, I don't know what we're using and what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree with Jim, and I also think that if the purpose of NAPLAN would be to monitor the system's performance, basically ask whether the education system is doing a good job and where the issues are, we don't really need a census-based assessment for that. We could use a sample-based assessment, just like it's done in the United States, or the international large-scale assessments are doing exactly the same thing. NAPLAN is a fairly expensive exercise. We spend about $100 million a year for doing that, and we could do this much cheaper. And by sample-based assessments, for the policy-making purposes, we could also expand the scope of the assessment that is now only looking at a very narrow area of schools' performance to cover many more issues that are equally important than literacy and numeracy right now. So I don't think that we can or we should use the NAPLAN data for individual school, or let alone the individual student level purposes at all. The problem here in fairly advanced education systems like Australia is that the more we do that, the more we take the responsibility and opportunity that Stephen was speaking about, that the teachers and schools should be actually the primary places where the judgment what the kids are learning and how well they learn what they learn should be. So more we rely on the system level things like NAPLAN or standardized assessments, the less teachers and schools will have room and authority to do that. And I think that that's a big problem here in Australia.
Stephen, do you have anything to add on that note before we move to the next question?
I might add on just to sort of extend Pasi's closing statement there, which I absolutely agree with. I mean, he made the comment that like using system level measurements to measure individual schools and teachers, you know, is very much misguided. I mean, in the same way, we wouldn't measure how well one classroom or one student does and say, well, that's how well the entire state of Victoria does, or the entire state of South Australia, or the country more generally. So again, it's aligning that sort of initial purpose with, and the tool you have with the measurement you're actually trying to achieve. Teachers are going to know their students well, and they can make very, very, you know, detailed and intense comments on them without having this sort of very, very broad scale, you know, top-down measurement to facilitate that.
Right. If we have time, I'll have a follow-up question on that. But for now, we'll move to the questions from the audience. So could Jim speak to why and in which ways he thinks NAPLAN is a good test?
I think it's, I said in my original point that it's a good test because when it was started out, I was part of the building team, I guess, that's one of the things we've done, but it was built on the state-based tests, which were well received and well used by schools, etc. And it was then taken to be at a national level. And if you look at the way the items are written, the way the test specifications are built, etc., and you look at the reliability, you look at the validity measures, etc., they're all good. The items are the probably most scrutinised items around the place, and there are not lots of errors with them. They're quite good questions. It all comes back to what happened when we went from the state to the national. That was okay. And then the idea was we'd use it to give feedback to schools once and parents, etc., about how your child is going. We only do that once in 12 years, or years 3, 5, 7, and 9 through national testing. This is a little bit of information. I don't see it as either or. I think it fits quite nicely with what teachers do. And the only reason, and another reason why I'd say it's actually a good test, is because the results confirm what the teachers already know in most cases. It's just taken from another perspective. When it's used that way, it's good. But when it loses its value, when people misuse it, when people select on the basis of an individual score which wasn't designed for that, when people go out and show how many top bands they've got, etc., on my school website or advertising venues, etc., it wasn't designed for that. It doesn't take into account the innate ability of the kids, etc.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. So next question. Can the implementation of NAPLAN be changed to address the current issues, or is a complete rethink needed? So I'll go to maybe start with Stephen on that one, and then go to Jihyun and Pasi.
Thanks, Scott. Again, I think maybe this particular point in time, given that we're rethinking so many things that we previously considered taken for granted. I mean, we're now looking at companies that are saying work from home more days of the week than not. We're rethinking how we organise society in this moment of lockdown. So I think it probably is even though there's been repeated calls over the years to rethink how NAPLAN's implemented, my personal belief would be to take a more wholesale view of it and say, rather than tinkering around the edges, like go back to the premise of what Jim said at the very start of the session. What is it designed to do? Is it achieving that? And if it's not, what do we need to do? Do we need a different test? Or do we need to change the assumptions that are built into how we use such assessments? How does it articulate with other ways of determining student and school and system level achievement that we might already have? Or might be alternatives like sample-based testing, which we've already heard about from Pasi in particular. I think there are very many questions that need to be asked, and I think just saying, you know, little things around the edges or at the margins now may not necessarily take advantage of this moment. So my personal belief would be go back to the very beginning and ask, like, is this achieving what it needs to be doing, or what do we even want it to be doing in the first place? And then seeing how all those two things match up.
Jihyun?
Yeah, my point is that even though the government tried to send this message that the NAPLAN data is not supposed to be used for that purpose, individual teachers and individual students, schools continue doing it. So I don't know where the gap is, why the government's message is not coming through. So it might be that it's very hard to change people's perception already, because NAPLAN has been going around for some time. So I think at this point, if I'm going to be advising to the government, I'll just try to say what kind of information is there in the NAPLAN, so that the people's attention can be shifted, rather than like revamping everything or revising the test. Because I agree with Jim that NAPLAN test itself is not a bad test, actually. I even have a paper that compare NAPLAN result and the school-based assessment, and the correlation is about 0.6 and 0.7, exactly where it should be landing. So I sort of have to trust in the NAPLAN test based on the research that I have done. So yeah, so my point is just let's shift the debate a little bit more of what kind of data we can use more from the NAPLAN, instead of like restructuring the whole thing. Because we actually, academics, have suggested different ways of adding more, different ways of doing NAPLAN, but it's not just happening. So let's just dig in more data from the NAPLAN that we have already.
Anything to add quickly to that, Pasi, before we go to the next question?
Yeah, very quickly. I think the key problem from my point of view, I moved here from Finland a year and a half ago, so I may have a different view on these things. But I think my school actually is the problem here, and breaking the link between my school and NAPLAN data would be one thing. But I still repeat my proposal, that is to shift to sample-based assessment that will do equally reliable and good job, and strengthen the trust and role of teachers in assessing students and school performance.
On that note, there's too many questions to get to all of them before we're out of time, but a recurring theme in the questions at this point is both this idea of a sample-based assessment that Pasi has flagged, and also the idea of whether we can just purely go to teacher judgment. So I want to ask, what data does NAPLAN provide that a sample-based assessment and teacher judgment can't provide? Start with Jim on that one.
In sample-based assessment, I mean, it's exactly the same, except you pick a 15% sampling, and then you compare, states or whatever you want to do on the basis of that. We already do that. We actually have sample-based assessments in science, ICT, and civics and citizenship. So we're just saying now we take that and put it into literacy and numeracy, which is, fine. The problem with that, from where we go, and I have no problem if the purpose is just to compare states effectively and to look at how this state's going over time. But one of the key purposes when this is set up is, as I said before, this is one more bit of a data given from a different perspective to parents on the way through and schools on the way through from K to 12. We actually have no testing of any of individuals en masse from K to 12. So whether the teacher's doing a good job or not, they might be, but there's no other evidence to tell them they're doing a good job. So if you think of it like that, NAPLAN, sample test is fine. If the purpose is, I just want to compare, if I want to give parents information back about their children all the way through, sample test won't work, and therefore we've got a problem.
Okay, everybody, just a very quick addition to that if you have it. We're going to have to wrap up any moment now.
I mean, over the years, I'm going back and forth whether the sample base is better or population base is better. I mean, of course, because all the other larger scale assessment actually taking the sample based test. So naturally, we go for the idea of sample based test. But I mean, this year, I'm changing my mind to maybe see the merit of population based, because the fact that the NAPLAN is population-based testing is because Australia can do it. Any test, we would all agree if you are a quantitative researcher, that the data from population is much better than data from the sample. Sampling is always supposed to be good, but there's always a lot of flaws in sampling. So I'm going back to the fact that the NAPLAN is okay based on population, because then everyone gets the scores. It's kind of like going with the egalitarian idea of Australia, that everyone gets the similar stuff. So because now we soak into this NAPLAN sort of culture, that if we go back to sample base, then some schools or some individual or whatever tests, then some teachers say, I used to have NAPLAN, where is NAPLAN? That's not the main reason, but then the benefit of population test is much better than sample-based test.
Okay, now we're running over time. Any one sentence comments from Stephen or Pasi?
A little one sentence sort of rejoinder. If we are seeing such close correlation between what NAPLAN measures and what teacher judgment and like in-class formative assessment and summative assessment measures, I mean, that sort of begs the question to me, why do we need another test that tells us what we already know at great expense?
Yeah, can I just add a reminder for everybody, to journalists and others here, that we should always keep in mind that teachers only account about 10% of the variation of students' test scores in NAPLAN and other tests. And another 20% is probably school-related things, but most of this variation is outside of the school. And unless we understand this, then I think the census-based assessments are always worse than sample-based assessments in order to make sure that people really understand what they are testing and measuring about.
Okay, that is all that we have time for. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. So thank you to all of our experts. Thank you to everyone for attending today. Now, the recording will be available on our social media channels from early next week, or if you'd like a direct link, get in touch with us at media@mcera.org.au. If you do want to continue this conversation and have any more questions for our experts, feel free to get in touch with us to get their contact details at media@mcera.org.au. So thank you again, everybody, especially experts, and goodbye.